Before we begin this video, I'd like to just point out that if you scroll down to the description area and click Show More, you'll find a convenient table of contents that you can use to skip ahead to different areas within the video. So scroll on down, find the table of contents, and use it as needed. I'd like to welcome you to this online lecture on the evolution of learning theories. In this session, we will explore some of the key learning theories that are fairly prominent in the literature and talk a little bit about them from a chronological perspective and also from a practical perspective of how they influence the development of learning design. So how they can actually be applied and taken into consideration. This is a brief introduction. That's not an exhaustive analysis of all of them, something that's very important to keep in mind. There's a lot of nuance that is involved with some of them, and there are a number of theories that where you won't specifically discuss because they're offshoots or they're related to some of the ones that we will be discussing. So I really do encourage you to explore some of these on your own, and I'll provide some resources toward the end of the lecture for doing so. As we start, I really want to point out this really wonderful mind map that was developed by Daniel Tay. I'd love to take credit for it, but I can't because I didn't create it. But it is a really, really nice piece of work here that describes how some of the key theorists have contributed to some of those key theories. So with that, let's go ahead and begin. Looking at this timeline of some of the major learning theorists, we can see that the legend here actually shows 5 different categories of learning theory: behaviorist, cognitivist, constructivist, humanist, and social learning. Now, we can actually take these and boil them down. So without going into detail on these particular theorists, let's break these down into just 3 general families of learning theories. Now, different individuals will maybe label these differently, but for our purposes, this is probably a reasonable way to summarize them. So we're going to boil them down into behavioral theory, cognitive theory, and social constructivist and human theory. Now, let's begin by discussing behavioral theory a little bit and describing some of the elements of behavioral theory that make it unique. Now, typically, when we think of behavioral theory, many of us think back to Ivan Pavlov and his early experiments with dogs. But other theorists in this area also include B.F. Skinner, John Watson, and Edward Thorndike. Looking at Pavlov particularly, I think most of us in school learned about Pavlov's famous experiments with a dog, where the basic experiment went like this. The dog was exposed to the smell of food, and at the same time that it was exposed to the smell of food, a bell was rung. When the dog was exposed to the food, when it smelled the food, it would begin to salivate and eventually began to associate the presence of food with the bell. So simply ringing the bell would then cause the dog to salivate. So this is the classic stimulus response model, the idea being that the subject is exposed to some type of stimulus, and as a result of that stimulus, then exhibits some sort of a behavior. So the outcomes of behavioral theories in general are really measured entirely by whether or not the behavior is exhibited. Really doesn't have anything else to do with anything that the learner may or may not have actually learned, other than the fact that they can exhibit that behavior. If they can do the behavior, they are considered to have had a successful learning outcome. Stimulus response and behaviorism tends to ignore outside influences. So things like prior knowledge and prior experiences and emotional reactions to situations are really disregarded. It's just entirely all about the behavior and whether or not that behavior is exhibited. Another variation on behavioral theory is that of B.F. Skinner. Skinner is a bit more contemporary than Pavlov. And In Skinner's theory, which is typically referred to as operant conditioning, this is typically the model that's used for animal training. And in the Pavlov model, it's important to note that the stimulus comes before the behavior. So the subject is exposed to the stimulus and then exhibits the behavior. But in Skinner's model, it's the other way around. The subject performs the behavior, and as a result of performing the behavior, is then met with some sort of positive or negative consequence. So if the behavior is one that is wanted, is considered to be a positive learning outcome, if you will, the reward is a positive reward. It's a positive consequence. The subject associates the behavior with something pleasant, something good. If it's something you want to avoid, the subject associates it with some sort of a negative consequence. So maybe the child who approaches the hot stove reaches out to touch it and then immediately gets a very loud no. We would consider that a negative consequence. And the behavior is then associated with a negative consequence. Hopefully they don't do that again. So this is the idea behind the Skinner theory of operant conditioning. So because the learning is entirely really focused on the ability to produce the behavior, the question that arises is behavior really learning? Is there any knowledge that's actually acquired other than a knowledge of the association between the behavior and the consequence, or the behavior and the stimulus? And this is really where the debate kind of arises. So we could argue that no, there isn't really a lot of factual knowledge beyond that. There's certainly no ability for critical thinking or original thought that's produced. There's no thought about past experiences and past knowledge and how those might influence the outcomes. All of that stuff is pretty much assumed away. So there really is no problem-solving ability that's imposed. It's just kind of a binary decision. Do the behavior or don't do the behavior. Now, for that reason, one of the issues with behavioral theory, when we look at it from an evaluation standpoint, is that we're not always 100% certain as to the causality or even the direction of the causality. Now, I always love using this cartoon because it was just kind of cute and funny, but it actually makes a point along those lines. So here's the dog saying, "Watch what I can make Pavlov do. As soon as I drool, he'll smile and write in his little book." So it's kind of an absurd concept, but the idea again remains that we can't really be sure about the causality here because we're not really considering any of these outside influences or environmental or social factors. There's no consideration of peer influence, for example. So when would you use behavioral learning theory? Can it be used? I mean, it doesn't sound like it's very strong from the standpoint of building individuals who have this, problem-solving ability and the thought and the ability for constructive, critical thought. Well, let's think some about the ways it's used. Drill and practice exercises. Clearly, you get a right answer, you get a wrong answer, and maybe you get points associated or a deduction of points associated with that. Positive verbal reinforcement. This has been used for millennia in classrooms to help manage student behavior by teachers. Rote work. Again, being able to get right answers or wrong answers and having some satisfaction associated with getting things right or wrong is a form of behavioral learning theory. Awarding of points. Anything that constitutes a positive or a negative consequence is essentially part of that model. Real-time simulations. So now here we're starting to get into a little different area because this is not something we normally think of with behavioral theory, but The fact is that again, there is a positive or negative consequence. In a simulation, the learner has the ability to make decisions, and as they make those decisions, as they do things, as they perform actions or behaviors, there are negative or positive consequences that arise from those actions. So we can argue that there is some element of behavioral learning theory that's associated with simulations. By the same token, role play exercises. Now, some of the more useful areas, I think, self-defense and martial arts training. Now, here's one where you think about it. You don't really want to take the time for problem solving in a situation where split-second decisions must be made. So if someone comes at you with a knife, you don't want to go through the process of thinking through, okay, what did I do that maybe caused this behavior? What could I have done to avoid it? There's no time for that. There's time for it later, but the immediate response needs to be an immediate behavior, an immediate defensive action that's taken. So in those types of cases, behavioral theory is exactly the type of learning theory that should be relied upon. Military training, law enforcement training. So situations where there are occasions in which there is no time for problem solving, the only appropriate response has to be, I kind of hesitate to call it a knee-jerk reaction because we have no control over knee-jerk reactions, but it has to be that fast and not have to have any forethought other than recognition of the situation and then production of the response. So these are all situations in which behavioral learning theory can be used and is actually used quite successfully on a regular basis. Next, we move on to cognitive theory. This is a somewhat different approach than behavioral theory. It's actually quite different. Cognitive theory grew out of the Gestalt psychology movement of the late 19th century and early 20th century. And it's really all about the ability of the mind to create relationships between individual component parts and the whole of some concept or object. That's kind of a mouthful. Gestalt psychology just really deals with how the mind deals with information, how it deals with new knowledge. And this is very much about knowledge and information. And it's many ways similar to kind of how computers work in terms of an input-output process. So with computers, you basically put data into them, they process the data, they analyze the data, they do stuff to the data, and then they save it and or output it upon demand. So the central focus here isn't on behavior, it's on information and or knowledge, depending on how you want to look at it. So if we think about cognitive learning theory, there really are three key laws that tend to apply to it that are very often cited. First of all, the law of similarity. And the law of similarity basically says that our minds work best with information that is similar rather than dissimilar. So if we have concepts or we're exposed to concepts that are similar, we will tend to group those concepts together into sort of a classification or a group of concepts. So our brains tend to work in this mode of classifying things and ideas and objects. And that's related to the law of similarity. Next, we have the law of proximity. The law of proximity is kind of similar, where we tend to group things together that are close in proximity, whether that's physical proximity or chronological proximity, but things that we can associate as being close in some way tend to get classified into their own individual grouping. And then finally, there's the law of closure. And this is kind of an interesting one. The law of closure basically says that we tend to look at objects that have closure to them, that are complete in some graphical way, as being more stable versus objects that have gaps in them. So let's take a look at an example here to see what that means. Here are some graphical objects that have gaps. Well, there's a couple things here about this phenomenon that's pertinent to learning theory when it comes to cognitivism. One is that our brains tend to fill in gaps. So if we take a look at the squares in the second in the middle, there are two squares. There's a white square and a black square. Now, the white square in the middle is really just inferred from the positioning of the objects on the outside, the black ones. And for that matter, the objects on the outside are not really a square. They're really just a series of four triangles. But positioned in this way, our brains kind of fill it in and interpret this as there being two squares, a white square and a black square. And again, looking at the other objects, they all have gaps in them, but we can kind of fill in those gaps mentally and then generalize what the object would look like without those gaps. We can infer that object. Objects, according to the law of closure, that have gaps in them tend to be more memorable. Objects that do not have gaps, that are completed objects, so just a complete square, for example, are a little less memorable. So we tend to focus on these objects that have inherent gaps in them. So this is kind of an interesting phenomenon, and it's one that we can very easily and very readily see when we look at examples such as this one. Now, another key idea in cognitive thinking is that of chunking. And this is chunking of information. And a lot of this is done, comes from a lot of research that was done by Miller, and this was in the mid-50s. And in his research, what Miller found was that people can tend to remember numbers more readily than they can letters, unless those letters happen to spell out a word. But if we were just looking at random numbers, people will tend to remember numbers more easily than letters. And specifically, they will remember numbers in chunks. In other words, they don't remember one number at a time in a long string. They will remember groups of numbers. So each group is thought of as a chunk. Now, the number of chunks that can typically be remembered is 7, plus or minus 2. So most people can remember 7 chunks of information plus or minus 2, so ranging from 5 to 9. And a good example of how this works is taking a look at the phone number below, which happens to be the telephone number for the Pepperdine Graduate School of Education and Psychology. Now, if we just look at it as a string of numbers, 13105685775, that is much more difficult to remember than if we break it into chunks, 13105685775. The chunks have some significance. There's a prefix, there's an area code, there's the main number. So these chunks are more readily remembered. It's a lot easier to remember them broken down into these groupings of characters or numbers than they are individually. So bottom line, cognitive learning theory is all about the information, how we perceive it, how we process it, and then how we store it. Now, the way we store it is typically in two areas. And physiologically, this bears out, if we look at it from a neurological or a cognitive neuro standpoint, of working memory and long-term memory. This is really similar to how computers work. So if in a computer, typically you have some sort of long-term storage, which is like a disk drive or a flash drive or something like that. And then you have the short-term storage, which is the RAM. And the RAM is basically where the CPU puts information while it's processing it. It's fast, it's easy to get to. And then when it's done with it, it stores it in its long-term storage. And we work much the same way as humans. We have working memory, areas of our brains where we store information while we're processing it and analyzing it and thinking about it and remembering it and making sense of it. And then the long-term storage where it goes for future recall. So while I look at that telephone number and I step away and don't think about it for a few minutes, it's probably gone. Unless I go to use it, or I do some other sort of analytical process with it. Maybe I turn it into a mnemonic. Maybe I find what letters the numbers correspond to and come up with words and come up with another association for it. With that processing in my working memory, I have a better chance of getting it into my long-term memory and then being able to retrieve it or recall it at a later time. So this idea of chunking is really all about how we store information, how we keep it in our working memories long enough to process it and then get it into our long-term memories. And when we get into long-term memory, that's what we would consider to be deeper learning, because we know we can reliably go back to that long-term memory and recall that information in the future. Now, another concept associated with cognitive learning theory is that of mental models or mental schema. And one of the key ideas in cognitive theory is that our brains tend to reduce information into some sort of symbolic nature. In other words, we think of things, intangible concepts, in tangible terms. We try to find some way that we can visualize those ideas in ways that we can make sense of and we can more easily recall. And this is essentially the whole idea behind data visualization. So if we look at those line graphs up there, it's a whole lot easier to remember the trend on one of those line graphs than it is to remember the numbers that make up the trend. The numbers are really not that important. The trend is really what's kind of important. But by visualizing it in the form of a graph, we can make sense of it much more quickly and easily, and we can recall it much more reliably. Mental models are also often done with mind mapping software. And these are programs that allow us to basically take ideas and put them together in a graphical format, connect them, put together flows between them, kind of like a flow chart, and similar to what you see on the screen there. But a mind map, an example of a mind map would be on the bottom right-hand corner of the screen there. And this is where we can take these ideas, we can represent them graphically, and then we can add some directionality to them in terms of maybe, what type of action or behavior flows from another idea or consequence, whatever the heck it happens to be. In computer terms, this is very similar to flowcharting. It essentially is flowcharting. It's a way of taking some of these abstract concepts and then being able to document them and display them in a graphical way that somebody else can comprehend and can kind of see what we see in our heads. It's a really good way to help communicate those ideas. So this is the idea of mental schema. The idea is that our brains tend to rely on symbology in terms of these concepts. So from a very practical standpoint in learning theory, one of the ways you can help somebody to learn something is by symbolizing it for them in a way that they are going to be able to comprehend much more quickly. Again, things like the mind maps, the graphs, any sort of data visualization process that can help take an abstract idea and make it more visually tangible. Now, some of the key cognitive theorists, Jean Piaget. Now, Piaget is actually kind of known as a constructivist theorist, but he actually quite a bit with respect to symbolization of abstract concepts, and he's contributed considerably to cognitive theory. Jerome Bruner, more contemporarily. David Merrill, much more contemporary. And George Miller. So these are all names that are associated with this idea of cognitive learning theory. Now, cognitive learning theory was really kind of a major change from behavioral learning theory. And from cognitive theory, we started to get all kinds of other offshoots. Without going into all of them, there's quite a bit of overlap between cognitive theory and some of the other theories that will come out of it that we'll address here shortly. Some of the variants. of cognitive theory includes social cognitive theory. Albert Bandura is one of the key names associated with that. Situated cognition, experiential learning, multiple intelligences, learning by doing, which is a Dewey concept. So again, lots of different directions that cognitive theory can go in, and lots of overlap with other theories. It's not so much an either or. It's not really a binary choice as to which one you choose, but it's important to understand there's a lot of nuance to many of these theories and a lot of overlap in interesting areas. Now, as we move along from cognitive theory, we essentially transition over to a family of theories that I'll term as social, constructivist, and humanist theories. So it's really a collection of theories, and they represent a little bit of a change in the thought process as opposed to cognitive theory. Now, cognitive theory basically is all about the content and the knowledge. From a pedagogical or a practical standpoint, you can say it probably has more to do with the teacher than it does with the learner. The humanistic theories are a bit of a transition. They change from the focus being on the teacher or the instructor to the focus being on the human, the learner, and that learner's human emotions and personal goals and objectives, and what they want to do with the knowledge and their motivations for acquiring the knowledge. So it's really a little bit more contextualized than just strictly looking at the knowledge and how to convey it. So one of the ways of looking at this is through Abraham Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where Maslow essentially proposed that there's a hierarchy to the needs of a human, beginning with the basic physiological needs. You have the need to survive. If you can't survive, nothing else is really that important to you. Safety comes next. If you can survive, you need to be able to remain safe and not threatened by harm or from harm. Next come the needs for love and belonging, followed by the need for esteem, and then finally self-actualization. So each one of these needs builds upon the prior needs. You can't jump ahead without resolving each one of those needs individually. So this is the basic concept here, is that when we're looking at humanistic theories, Maslow is probably a good way to think about it in terms of this need to be able to identify at what stage an individual is at, and how that then relates to their quest for knowledge and the needs for that knowledge. Now, if we look at some of the humanistic theories, one of the key factors that is really kind of different from cognitive theories, and behavioral for that matter, is the effect of social influence. So when we're looking at these humanistic theories, these social learning theories, there's an acknowledgement that the social environment, and by social, I don't necessarily mean socializing. I'm not talking about cocktail parties, but the idea that people interact with people on a daily basis. In a family environment, in a workplace environment, in social environments, there's always interactions with other people. Those interactions influence how we learn. So, for example, in a workplace environment, what we observe, what we see, what we talk to people about influences our acquisition of knowledge about how to best do our jobs. This is acknowledged, this phenomenon is acknowledged when we look at social learning theories. And one of the transitions that has, observed from cognitive theory over to social learning theories is this notion of social cognitive theory. So it's kind of rooted in cognitive theory. It doesn't say cognitive theory doesn't exist or that it's not valid, but it extends it by acknowledging that social environment can affect cognitive acquisition of knowledge. So one of the pivotal researchers in this area was Albert Bandura in 1970s. He did a fairly famous set of experiments called the Bobo doll experiments. And what he essentially did was he took 3 groups of children. And in one group, he basically gave the group of children access to a room full of toys, one of which included a Bobo doll. In the second group of children, he gave the children access to the same room, but the children were also exposed to a video that showed adults playing aggressively with the Bobo doll. They smacked it around, they whacked it with a hammer. So the children saw this beforehand, and then were allowed into the room full of toys. In the third group of children, they were exposed to a video where they saw adults playing more passively with the same toys and not really paying attention to the Bobo doll. Nothing drew particular attention to it. Well, when he then observed how the children behaved in this room full of toys, almost predictably, the children that observed the adults playing aggressively with the Bobo doll did the same thing. They smacked it around, they whacked it with a hammer, they played very aggressively with the Bobo doll, versus the control group and the group where they were not exposed to the video, but they were exposed to a video where the adults were playing more passively. And it basically drew the conclusion that observation has a huge impact on acquired knowledge, in this case, the knowledge of what is acceptable behavior and what is not, and also on the ultimate behavior that might be associated with that knowledge. So this is the idea of social cognitive theory. If we see something, that observation tells us something about the world and how the world works, and what is acceptable or not acceptable, or effective or ineffective. All these different things are built into just simple social observation. Another key theory that kind of comes out of this same idea is that of social constructivist theory, or situated learning theory. Now, these are all very, very closely related ideas, and they primarily came out of a book called Situated Learning, Legitimate Peripheral Participation by Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger. This was published in the early 90s. And what Lave and Wenger did was an observational study where they really wanted to learn more about how people learn in apprenticeship situations. So the book is essentially a case study, or a series of case studies, of 5 different types of apprenticeship programs. And they range from tailors to quartermasters in the United States Navy, and members of the AA, interestingly enough, looking at that as a type of apprenticeship. So it's essentially the idea of learning while on the job, learning from someone who is more experienced in a particular field. And they wanted to really study the dynamics of how that works. Well, the basic element here is that when individuals learn in that type of environment, they're not necessarily just learning from one teacher or instructor. They're really learning from a community of practitioners in that particular field. It's not just one-on-one instruction. There is one-on-one instruction, but that's not all there is to it. So this also kind of picks up this idea of observational learning. When somebody is learning on the job, they look around, they look to see how other people behave. They pick up on some of those visual cues that they see. In the AA, for example, a new member might walk in and pay close attention to the demeanor of other individuals. They want to fit in. They want to kind of behave like everybody else behaves, so they don't stand out as being inappropriate in some way. So this idea of observational learning just plays right into it. It's exactly along the same lines. So the idea of situated learning is that learning best works when it is situated in the type of environment or the environment in which it's going to be practiced. This is the idea behind this apprenticeship process or on-the-job training. So if you're learning about the job while you're doing the job, you are going to have much deeper learning than if you learn about it in a classroom where you're not actually exposed to it. So again, this is the idea of situated learning. Now, again, the idea here is that the shift from cognitive learning to social constructivist learning is basically consistent with the shift from just really focusing on the knowledge and the content to focusing on the social interaction and acknowledging that that social interaction is going to have some sort of an effect. Now, one of the key terms that comes out of this idea is that of a community of practice. And this was a term that was coined by Levin Wenger. So a community of practice is really that community of individuals that are the practitioners in that particular field. Now, an important concept is that within a community of practice, not everybody is an expert. It's made up of all types of different levels of expertise and experience and knowledge. So it's everyone from the person maybe just studying about that particular practice for the first time, all the way up to the super experienced person who's the most knowledgeable person you could possibly think of to ask a question to. Everybody's included in this. They are all legitimate participants within the community of practice. And if they're just learning, they're approaching that community peripherally. And that's where this term legitimate peripheral participation comes from. The idea that all the participants in this community of practice are legitimate participants in that practice. So a community of practice has to be focused upon some sort of a practice, whatever that could be. It could be being a United States Navy quartermaster. It could be being a member of the Alcoholics Anonymous or being a tailor. It could be virtually anything. So this is the idea of a community of practice. And again, it goes along with the idea of situated learning. So while you're situated in this area and you're interacting with the people within this practice, you are learning from one another. You're not just learning from one instructor. You're not just conveying knowledge, but there's all kinds of transfer of knowledge going on a number of different levels. So what we term essentially this whole process is constructivist learning theory. Constructivist learning theory really comes out of much of the work of many of the Russian psychologists of the 19th century. Probably one of the most prominent constructivists was Lev Vygotsky. And the idea here was that constructivism acknowledges the social interaction, and it also acknowledges the background of the individual. And when I say background, I'm referring to their prior knowledge and their prior experiences. So if you're exposed to a new piece of knowledge, your reaction to that, your understanding of that is going to be largely predicated based upon what you already know and how you are able to make sense of that new piece of knowledge. So the term constructivism comes from the idea that as an individual, when you're exposed to a new concept or a new piece of knowledge, your first reaction is to try to construct meaning from that piece of knowledge. If it's some sort of an abstract idea, you're going to try to relate it to something you already know. And this is, again, the idea of constructivism. That process is where the learning occurs. You're trying to reconcile it with what you already know and then essentially extrapolate that or generalize that to reach some sort of conclusion about what's valuable or useful about this particular piece of knowledge. So that's what we call constructivism. So constructivism, essentially takes all of these things into consideration. We can basically call these all elements of constructivist learning theory. Now, quite a bit of work has been done in this area since the original work by Levin Wenger. Two of the most prominent researchers, John Seeley Brown and Paul Duguid. One of my favorite books on this is The Social Life of Information, which essentially explores this concept of how knowledge is conveyed socially. Now, where do we go from there? Well, this is kind of a never-ending thing. Just when we think that we know everything there is to know about learning, somebody comes up with a new idea. Now, I think it's important to recognize that these ideas don't supplant one another. It's not like we throw out behaviorism and we totally adopt cognitive theory, and we throw out cognitive theory and we adopt constructivist theory. It doesn't really work like that. And really what happens is that they extend one another. Each of these theories sort of adds something to the prior theories. Although if you were to talk to a strict constructivist and put them in a room with a strict cognitivist, they might not have a whole lot in common. But there is overlap. There is some gray area there. And you can find the connections between the two if you look for them. Now, in terms of emerging theories, one of the key ones that is that one called Connectivism. Now, Connectivism kind of acknowledges the fact that technology has changed how we learn and how we acquire knowledge. And again, when I'm talking about learning, I'm not strictly referring to classroom learning. I'm talking about learning, everyday learning on many different levels. The idea that technology has provided this ability for us to communicate and network with individuals that are far beyond our physical presence has really changed how we transfer knowledge between ourselves. So the idea of connectivism is based on the idea of shared knowledge. Many people share the same bits of knowledge and also have the ability to communicate with one another and with others. So consider the fact that there is shared knowledge and the ability to communicate that knowledge. So the idea of connectivism basically says that knowledge is not just what I know, all the facts that I can immediately recall and recite, but it's the fact that I know where to get the knowledge. So think of connectivism like not necessarily knowing the fact, but knowing where to go get the fact. Okay, I may not have that statistic off the top of my head, but I know where to get it. I can access it quickly and immediately, and I understand its relevance. So this is the idea of connectivism. It's this idea that we don't have to have all the knowledge, but we can get the other knowledge. We know where to get the other knowledge. We are connected to the networks that provide us access with that other knowledge. Connectivism, in my mind, by necessity, interacts with other learning theories. By itself, if you know where to get knowledge, or where to get information for that matter, but you don't really know what to do with it, you can't put it into practice, you can't really analyze it or critically assess it in any way, it's not very useful knowledge. So by necessity, you have to have an understanding of how that knowledge is relevant. So it by itself does not really stand alone. You can't say that connectivism replaces everything else. But I think we can make the valid statement that it extends the other concepts that are already been studied. So quite a bit of work being done on connectivism. I categorize this as an emerging learning theory, and in fact, if you look at much of the literature, a lot of it sort of is a little bit contradictory in that we're still trying to figure out what to make of this and how to define it and what it is exactly. So anyhow, connectivism is one of those key emerging theories, and one that is, I think, really worth paying attention to and doing some reading on. One thing to keep in mind is that the theories that we just discussed are really at a very summary level. There's a lot more nuance to many of these theories. There are a lot more theories that I actually didn't really go into detail on, but there are quite a few variations on the families of theories that I just mentioned. I would really encourage you to explore some of these on your own. There are quite a few really good resources out there for doing so. One of the ones that I particularly like is a book called How People Learn: Brain, Mind, Experience, and School. And it's by the Committee on Developments in the Science of Learning, published by the National Academies Press. It's a very accessible book, meaning it's not a difficult one to read. It does a pretty good job of explaining a lot of the basic concepts that are in both the theories that we discussed and several that we didn't, in addition to a lot of practical application of those theories. Another one, and I would suggest this one if you're a little bit of a theory geek in particular, Contemporary Learning Theories of Learning Theorists in Their Own Words. Now, this is the work of quite a few of the theorists, many of which we mentioned in this video, and quite a few others, but it's actually their own work. Now, whenever possible, I always suggest to graduate students that you always go to primary sources whenever possible. Don't just rely on the secondary sources that talk about what someone had to say, but read what they had to say for themselves in their own words. This is a pretty good book for doing that. These are all articles that were published by each of these individual theorists, so you can read what they had to say in their own words, always much more powerful and gives you the opportunity to decide what is meaningful about what they have to say and to reach your own conclusions rather than what someone else tells you the conclusion should be. Finally, again, for those of you that are really enjoying the theory aspect of this, Theoretical Foundations of Learning Environments, edited by Susan Land and David Jonasson. Again, these are mostly primary sources here. So these are actually many of the theorists in their own words. And I think this is actually a particularly good book for exploring many of these concepts. So there are quite a few resources out there. I encourage you to take a look. If not these, many of the other ones out there. Some really good books and some very good articles that explore them. So I encourage you to learn all that you can, and I hope you enjoy doing so.